Well, first of all, they're big. If you go, oh my God, that rat's huge, you're probably looking at a water rat.
The pest black rat species are implicated in, I think, about 54% of recent bird extinctions.
Water rats being up to 5 times the size of a black rat, they should beat up black rats. It's basically the idea that a big dog beats up a little dog, and the water rats are definitely the big dog, and the black rats don't really like a fight. If you give the sort of native species a chance, there's a good opportunity that they'll be able to play pest management roles.
Today on Off Track Summer Season, we're by the water, searching for the largest rodent in Australia. Anne Jones with you on RN, and in this episode, an elusive native animal, which is sort of like Australia's version of the otter. Associate Professor Peter Banks has a thing for rats. It's not what you normally hear, is it? And Professor Banks's takeaway message from his conservation biology in some way differs from the norm as well. He says that native fauna isn't as feeble as we think it is. If given the chance, it can solve some of our pest problems. And of course, his speciality is rats.
What is it with you and rats?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Some people say, people look like their study animal, and I've got these two relatively large incisors. So maybe that's it. I don't know. No, rats are amazing. They're like 25% of the mammal diversity. They're 25% of the mammals, the native mammals that we've got in Australia. And they're an amazing group, ranging from things through to squirrels, capybara. We've got a huge diversity in Australia. There's some of the worst pests of humans and spreaders of diseases that have plagued humanity over the years, as well as they do amazing things in ecosystems. They are by far the coolest animals.
Or your waders.
Suburbia is right on the doorstep. So this is Sydney Harbour National Park, and it's sort of made up of fragments of bushland remnants, and it's all surrounded by the lower North Shore, so some of the wealthiest properties in Sydney. But thankfully for the rest of us, we've got these beautiful bits of national park. Most of it is pretty good. It's naturally vegetated. There's not too many weeds, and there's certainly lots of hidden wildlife. So we're pretty lucky. I mean, it's what everybody sees when they come to Sydney. You take the ferry to Manly and you see these beautiful national parks. Well, we're standing in it.
What are we waiting for?
Well, we're waiting for the tide to slowly creep out so that we can go and see whether or not there's any signs of water rats.
Let's go rat hunting.
Well, we're going down.
Oh, whoa.
We're going down there.
All right, I shall follow along.
Well, this is the Ricali, so that's the Aboriginal name for the water rat. It's quite distinct. It's semi-aquatic, so it spends a lot of its time in water, and it's filling the same sort of niche as otters. So swimming around in the water, chasing down some invertebrates that are in there, as well as getting onto land. They're the biggest rodent we have, and so they're filling a particular predatory niche. Probably people see it quite often, but they probably just look at it and see it's a rat, and they say a rat's a rat, and they're all the same. So probably people do know it, but they probably don't know what they're actually looking at.
Could you describe how people might spot them compared to other critters?
Well, first of all, they're big. If you go, oh my God, that rat's huge, you're probably looking at a water rat. They're also very distinct in having a white tip to their tail. It's not so much the tip, it's the latter third of their tail is white. Whenever people see them, they're probably going to look a little bit oily. They've got these giant whiskers that they use probably to forage around and search for little movement in the water and so forth when they're after things that are buried in the ground. It's dark, quite a dark colour, but what gives them their scientific name, Hydromys chrysogaster, is they've got a golden belly. The chrysogaster means golden belly, so underneath them they have this sort of yellowy, orangey gold, and they'll be big. I mean, there's brown rats around, that's an introduced rat, but water rats are 3 times their size, so they're a really big rat.
And it sounds like, they're in Sydney, for goodness sakes. They must be a little bit tenacious, are they?
They have to be. I mean, they've even been spotted at the Opera House.
Jenna, by the way, is Professor Banks's research assistant, and she's the one who's been getting out there and setting up the equipment to collect evidence of rats. At the moment, she's leading me down steps and into knee-deep water in Sydney Harbour.
And they just seem like really cool animals.
Why do you think they're really cool?
Well, they're Australia's largest rodent, and they form a niche that no other animal does in the Australian ecosystem. So they would be, I guess, possibly considered like Australia's otter. They are central place foragers, which means they do go out and collect their food and then bring it back to like a favourite eating site on a rock platform. And then you might find these piles created called middens, which are sort of the piles of their food scraps.
So what about their paws? Are they sort of like a bigger version of a mouse paw?
Their front paws have long claws, which would help them to deal with the food and the prey, but their back feet are partially webbed, which assists them in swimming and with aquatic life. People are mainly seeing them in parks along the harbour or down on rock platforms around the harbour. So mostly when people are either sort of living by the water or walking by the water. Sometimes they can be mistaken for other animals such as ringtail possums, given that both ringtail possums and water rats have a distinctive white tip on the end of their tail. And sometimes in the water they can be mistaken for platypus. Not so much around Sydney Harbour, but in other areas.
Because when they're swimming along, when they're motoring along, they do look like a furry little lump, sort of with a wake behind them, don't they?
Yes, definitely.
This is the secret beach of secret beaches, I reckon. No one ever comes here.
I can see why.
It's worth the effort, though.
It is. It's actually... Look, I can see some water birds skimming past. We're looking back towards... What would that suburb be?
So up on the hill, that's like Mossman, that's the Clifton Gardens part of Mossman.
Do water rats appear in more isolated places, or do they not mind being close to some human disturbance?
Well, where we've picked them up, because we were a little bit restricted in where we could go, because we went to places where we could get access, because everywhere around the harbour there's lots and lots of landowners and it's quite difficult to get their permission to come and look for rats, as you can imagine. So we found them mostly in association with little water courses coming in. There's no evidence that they really exploit, they can rely solely upon human resources that I know of. So they're still sort of living natural, so it's those natural areas that probably are more important to them.
All right, let's go see if we can find some tracks. Okay, so they do get about in the water having a bit of a hunt and a bit of a play, maybe a bit of a socialise as well, but where do they sleep or hide?
Yeah, so they've got multiple burrows and they'll be resting on the shore. They've got several burrows that are perhaps a metre long, I suppose, that go into the embankment where they can rest, but they'll have several of those throughout their home range that they'll use in different times, and they'll take refuge there during the day generally, because they are, even though they're not an apex predator, so they're not like a top predator, but they are hunted by other things, so there's all sorts of birds of prey that would like to eat them, but they do nevertheless come out during the daytime to try and have a scrounge around for what they can get. So they're real omnivores as well as being predators. They'll eat birds. There's even records of them eating bats. I don't know how they got the bat. The bat must have foolishly come to the ground. These are little micro bats. Many predators are similar in that sort of way, in that they'll also scavenge what they can get, and that's what we're trying to sort of see signs of today.
Is there any estimate on how many water rats we have in Sydney Harbour?
No. This is such an easy question, but so difficult to pin down. Like, one of the traditional ways of trying to work these sorts of things out would be to catch the animals, mark them in some way, and then try and recapture them, and then by the ratio of new animals to marked animals, you can get an estimate of how many there are. But the problem with these guys is that they're so smart. First of all, they don't want to get caught, so they know what to do to avoid it. And then secondly, if they do get caught, they're not going to come back. So it's very tricky.
You mentioned they're the biggest. How big are they? How would you describe them?
Well, The big males get well over a kilo, so 1.3, 1.5 kilos, which is pretty big. People who might know rats running around their house, if they've got, the old black rat, they're probably about 200 grams. So these are big. And that's partly what inspired us to look at what these rats were doing in an ecosystem and how they were interacting with those black rats, which also get into the bush. They come from people's houses and do get into the bush, and we were trying to find out whether or not this really giant, big rat was having some sort of interaction with these introduced rats.
So we were going around Sydney Harbour and looking pretty much for water rats around the harbour. We would go around in a boat and pull up on beaches around the harbour and set out traps. We at first were using hair tubes, which are like a plastic funnel with some bait at the back to attract the animal inside that the animals can't actually reach, and they have just a sticky wafer on top, so essentially a piece of paper with some glue on one side that's facing down, and when the animals put their nose in to sniff and then pull it back out, a little bit of hair gets left on the sticky paper, and we can then look at that under the microscope and identify which species has visited. And we were using that at first to test for abundance, but we then, as technology progressed, got onto infrared motion sensor cameras, and when we got these cameras, we set the cameras up to actually look and see what was happening at the hair tubes, and it showed us that the hair tubes weren't particularly effective at sampling the species that were present. There was, for example, lots of the pest black rat species that were visiting the tubes and not actually leaving any hair traces. So we realised that the cameras were a much better way of sampling the animals.
So you were sampling the abundance of multiple species. What's the overall aim of doing that?
In particular, we were looking to see the relationship of water rats to the invasive black rat, which are a big pest in Australia and around the world. They carry diseases that are transferable to humans and other animals. They're also big ecological pests. They're prolific climbers, and they are implicated in, I think, about 54% of recent bird extinctions. Most of those are on islands, but they're big predators of birds and other Australian native animals. They also outcompete other native animals for space, and they can be quite aggressive in their competition. Not that much is known about the ecology of the water rat, so we didn't know the best attractant to use for our bait to bring them into the traps to sample them. So we used 3 different bait types. We used peanut oil, sardine oil, and tuna oil. So water rats are carnivorous predators, and they mainly eat sea creatures, but they can also eat small birds, reptiles and mammals. So that's why we chose the fish attractants. The peanut one might sound a bit odd, but that's actually a standard mammal attractant for sampling. So in the end, we found that water rats were most attracted to sardine oil.
Why is it that we know so little about our biggest rodent?
That is a good question. I don't know. We should know more, really, because it is unique in so many ways. I mean, the rodents, just as a group, they don't attract necessarily a lot of research attention, and I seriously don't get it. I'm with you. I really don't get it, because they're amazing, fascinating creatures, and we should know more about what they're doing, particularly if there's a potential that they might be playing, positive sort of ecosystem management type roles that we hadn't thought of before.
Today on the shores of Sydney Harbour, you're with Off Track on RN, and I'm Anne Jones. We're ferreting around for an elusive rodent. It's Australia's largest rodent, in fact, the water rat. There are so many unanswered questions about this little animal, but to find out more today, we're with Jenna Bytheway and Associate Professor Peter Banks from the University of Sydney. All right, we've just had to take off our socks and shoes. The tide's a little bit high to come around to the most amazing little cove. Or is it a little bay? How would you describe it?
It's Taylor's Bay.
It is.
Yeah. So it's this little bay, and it's my favourite part of the city, really, because we're surrounded by natural bush. We're on our own little private beach, you can't see the built-up metropolis. You can just see, a little bit of the eastern suburbs there, and it's just beautiful.
We've got a view of yachts that are moored in the bay, and also of ferries whizzing past, some of them faster than others. I can also see some sea kayakers out in the early morning taking their exercise, and above me, as you can hear, we're under the flight path. It's the most amazing mix of natural and city, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. That's right. I mean, we're so lucky in Sydney to have this, Sydney Harbour National Park, really, and so much of it. It's a wonderful resource that you can come to these hidden little places that, you got to take the effort to get there, but when you do, it's so rewarding.
On the beach, we can see all sorts of debris. There's little shells, dirt. There's also quite a bit of rubbish that's washed up on the shore. Hey, Jenna, come over here to these rocks. What sort of things can we see that the rats might actually come down to eat?
I think they often like things like crabs and mussels and little fish and stuff. So even though they come up onto the rock platforms to actually often eat and pull, the crabs and mussels apart, I don't know how much they actually get off the actual platforms themselves.
Just peeking through a bit of a banksia that seems to have sort of come out prostrate from the rocks, we can see a rock platform, and in my mind's eye I can actually almost see a family of rats. However, we're not having much luck so far, are we, seeing them?
No, unfortunately not so far today. Yeah, and we're looking for any footprints in the sand as well, although the rain has made it slightly harder because it disturbs the prints a little bit. But it's very hit and miss, Yeah. Sometimes you get them, sometimes you don't.
The prints, can you see the web?
Yeah, you can see partial webbing if you look carefully. It depends how good the print is, and what do they look like? You can kind of see the claw marks, and definitely the partial webbing. We've got some pictures, but that won't quite help here.
That's all right, people can look on the website.
So we've got, around the harbour, we've got a lot of black rats. So they're the ship rat, they're rats that came with European settlers. Probably with the first fleet, there would have been rats on the ship that jumped ship there and set up in Sydney. They live with us in our suburban areas, but over time they've moved into the natural areas. And when they've done that in other parts of the world, they can be pretty devastating to the local wildlife. And not only that, they carry diseases. So our research agenda is really about trying to see whether or not native species can play some role in controlling these introduced rats, because theory tells us that whenever you've got an intact biodiversity, it's going to be robust to invasive species. And so if we can make and understand what makes for a robust native fauna, I think we can understand how we can control these rats. And so the water rat work is about trying to understand whether or not these water rats are playing any role in controlling black rats. And it makes sense, because water rats being up to 5 times the size of a black rat, they should beat up black rats. It's basically the idea that a big dog beats up a little dog, and the water rats are definitely the big dog, and the black rats don't really like a fight. And we think that, what we should find is that where you've got water rat activity, they can choose where they want to go, and in those sorts of places we should have low black rat activity, and that's what we were looking for in this particular bit of research.
And what did you find?
Yeah, well, we found that water rats were elusive. They're hard to survey for. We found them in a number of different spots around the harbour, probably 12. But we were glad to find places where they weren't, because we needed to find areas where they weren't as well as where they were. So we weren't just trying to find records of water rats. We also wanted to find where they weren't. And unfortunately, we found black rats pretty much everywhere. But when we had high activity of water rats, we had very low activity of black rats. When we didn't have any water rats, sometimes we had black rats, sometimes we didn't, and that sort of makes sense. But when we had lots of water activity, for whatever reason, probably the competition idea, the black rats were smart enough not to be around there, I think.
So what do you think, what might that sort of discovery lead to?
That discovery could lead to supporting, if we found that water rats could scare away black rats, then if we knew what sort of habitat that water rats liked, we would be able to provide that habitat and conserve it to encourage water rats to be around Sydney Harbour and potentially reduce black rat impacts and numbers.
I think too often a lot of Australians, the focus on Australian wildlife has really been on the impacts of introduced species and the fact that we've got so many species on the endangered list, the fact that we've got the world's worst record of mammal extinctions in Australia. We've got these marsupials that perhaps maybe they're not as good as the other sorts of placental mammals which the rest of the world have. I think we've got maybe, I don't know if it's a cultural cringe or whatever, but I think we've certainly got a view that somehow Australian wildlife is fragile. And we've got this fragile system that's going on here. But I don't think that that's actually true. I think in a lot of cases, the fauna that we have now has got a lot of opportunity to be robust to a lot of the threats that are being posed. We've got to understand the ecology of the system. It doesn't mean that there aren't threats to wildlife, by no means whatsoever. But I think there are opportunities to understand the ecology and in particular the interactions between native species and introduced species and use that to our advantage to change things just ever so slightly to give the natives a slight advantage so that they can have a bigger impact on introduced species. Like this that'd be all just covered in little prints of everything. So yeah, all sorts of things, small skinks, bigger skinks, dragons, birds, yeah, that's right, birds.
When you're finding the prints of water rats, are you finding them as solitary sets?
Well, see, why we came to this spot is because we saw two. We saw the big prints and little prints. So presumably that's, mother and child, mother and baby rat, yeah. So that's why we came here, yeah. There's a small beach over there we can look at.
Yeah, let's go over there and have a look.
Well, I mean, the fact that we think that it's still relatively common. Unlike a lot of rodents, for example, I mean, a lot of native rodents are the mammals that have gone extinct and disappeared from a lot of places, but the water rat's not. It's hung on. It's living in our biggest city. It's been living in association with humans for a long time. Under our noses, so to speak. Most people probably don't even know that they're there, and I definitely think that there's a role for it to play in controlling black rats. Just in the same way that people are talking about dingoes playing a positive role in controlling species like foxes and cats, the logic is exactly the same. You've got the bigger predator beating up on the smaller predator, and which is an introduced species, and therefore having flow-on benefits for the environment. Well, I really want to know more about water rats. So I want to understand, though, why they perhaps aren't in other spots, where they are moving, and then a bit more fine-grained information about the nature of the interaction with the black rats, perhaps what's driving it, whether or not black rats are smart enough just to know that the smell of a water rat is enough to avoid a certain spot, whether or not they'll coexist at all, whether or not the water rats change their behaviour, and then just to know more about what the water rats do, what their life is like, how they're using the harbour, what resources they're exploiting.
There are still so many questions. I mean, as a scientist, how do you manage to move forward? Because there's still so much to learn.
Oh, that's what's great. That's what's great about science. As soon as you find one thing out, there's a zillion questions that open up, and that is what keeps science fascinating and keeps you going all the time, because there's so many things to work out. What sends you down different pathways? I suppose what we're driven by is trying to understand the ecological role that these water rats play. So that's really what's going to drive exactly where we do go, and in particular, how they might interact with some of the sort of the local things that are important conservation issues. Our surveys for the water rats is just a part of a bigger agenda to look at the role of native rodents in controlling introduced rodents. And so in the same sorts of environments that we're looking for water rats, we've done an experimental reintroduction of a native bush rat. So these bush rats aren't bigger than black rats. They're about the same size, but they will be able to outcompete them as long as they are given the advantage. As long as we can get rid of all the black rats and put them in and allow them to establish, they'll stop black rats from reinvading. What's happened in the past is perhaps we've changed the bush, or there's been a fire or something that's wiped out the native species. Black rats have been able to move in and take over. If we can turn things back and give the bush rats the initial advantage, they should be able to hold their own. That's what theory says, and that's what we've been trying to demonstrate in these same sorts of environments where we've been looking for water rats. If you give the sort of native species a chance, there's a good opportunity that they'll be able to play these sorts of pest management roles. I mean, the fact that they can live in Sydney shows that they're pretty adaptable and they can exploit the resources that are here.
Professor Peter Banks and his research assistant Jenna Bytheway took me out to secret ratty hideaways on the harbour. We were there for hours, but we didn't even see any footprints. I think the rats are a little bit media shy. But you can see the water rats on our website, with night vision footage captured by the researchers themselves. You can even see evidence of a water rat chasing the introduced black rat out of its territory. That, plus the added option of listening to all the programs we've had so far on Off Track on RN, can be found over at abc.net.au/RN. I'm Anne Jones, and next week I'll take you somewhere else.